Hello, everyone, and welcome to the NEMSIS training today. Today is Tuesday, March 12th. Can you believe we're already in March? It's the annual meeting is right around the corner. Summer weather is right around the corner. So super excited about that. But that is the future. What is today is a presentation by Jen Correa, which was actually this is in response from a interest that was shown by state data managers. So we are listening, and we are trying to create content in these trainings that are relevant and that you've asked for, and this is one. And so in this one, Jen is going to be highlighting the compliance process and showing a comprehensive overview of the types and delving into the specifics of what each type of compliance entails. And with that, I'll just let you take it away, Jen. Let us know everything that we need to know about compliance.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, and welcome everybody. As Chris said, this is in response to some state data managers and some EMS provider agencies that have a general idea of what compliance is and where to find compliant vendors, but they were interested in more of the nitty-gritty about what vendors are actually tested on. So as they go through the compliance process, what are they looking at, right? Like, what are we trying to test them for? What can't we test them for? That's another part of the big question. So today during the talk, we're going to kind of understand the why behind NEMSIS compliance, like why did we do it? Why do we have it? And what does it provide for the agencies, the states, and the vendors as well, right? Making sure that we're trying to collect all of the data the same way. We're going to talk about some specific testing requirements for NEMSIS compliance and understand what can't be a part of NEMSIS compliance. Which surprisingly, we get asked a lot about, like, what aren't we testing for? Not by vendors, but by the states, especially as we get farther and farther into some states developing their own compliance processes. Please feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat. We are monitoring the chat as we go through. We're happy to answer any questions. If you have a question at the time and you want to raise your hand, we will unmute you, and please feel free to ask questions. This should be a very iterative process, right? Where it goes back and forth. It gives you the information that you need, that you're requesting, and it also will let us know what we might need to add to the presentation as well. So the first thing we're going to talk a little bit about is why NEMSIS compliance, right? So the goal of NEMSIS, the NEMSIS project as a whole, is to maintain this national repository of data, all the PCR data across the country and in our territories. It's harmonized with some of the registries. It's harmonized with CARES. We have trauma registries that's starting to more and more import the data. And to be able to do that, we have to have an apples to apples collection, right? The definitions need to be the same. The structure and the standard need to be the same. And that's what the NEMSIS project and NEMSIS compliance does, right? It's essential for maintaining and enhancing the quality and efficiency of the data. It improves the delivery of the data. It allows states to do comparisons and benchmarks. And that is part of why we do the compliance as well. Prior to compliance, we had a standard, but they could be implemented, in different ways, or software could just do most of the standard, but not all of the standard. And so we came up with NEMSIS compliance and the compliance process to ensure that they can collect all of the elements, that they have a place to collect those elements in the software. And a full document, you'll notice that there are some QR codes throughout the presentation. Please feel free to take pictures of those. They will take you to the links that are listed within the presentation itself. And a full document about why NEMSIS compliance is important and why do NEMSIS compliance can be found on the website on the compliance page. And funnily enough, it's called Why Compliance. So real brief overview of the different types of compliance. Most folks are aware that there are receive and process level softwares, which is your state level software. So a receive and process software does not create an ePCR ever, but it receives and ingests that data, and then we'll send it on to the National Data Repository, or if you have a partnership with other companies out there to house your data, or you are sending data to different things like ODMAP or anything like that from a state level, you can do it through your receive and process software. They receive the PCR, they process it, and they're tested on the ability to do that, not just for the national elements, but for all of the elements when they go into their testing process. And then there's the collect and send. That's where the ePCRs are getting created, right? So that's the field level product that your EMS provider agencies are using. They are tested on the data entry. They're tested on having all of the elements. They're tested on being able to generate demographic data, and also to create and generate and send custom elements. So NEMSIS compliance resources. Who's compliant? How long have they been compliant? When did they first get compliant? That's a question we get asked quite a bit. That information is available on the NEMSIS website. If you're going to the website, you go to the technical resources page and drop down to the compliance software and compliance testing status page, or you can take a picture of this QR code and it'll take you to the same place. And that will give you the name of the vendor of the software name, what version they tested with. It'll also give you their original compliance date, when they last recertified, if they've been attending the V3 implementation calls, and if they attended the annual meeting. And those are required to maintain their compliance. If they do not maintain their compliance, the first step that happens is probation, right? So they start to show up in red. Probation could happen for missing your recertification deadline. You only have 2 years from the last date of compliance to when you have to recertify your compliance. And that's so that we can check for any major changes to the software, especially as, things are added, custom elements are added within a state, anything like that. We need to keep checking the software that it stays compliant. That's why we have that every 2 years. So if you miss that by a few days, you can lose compliance, or I'm sorry, you can go on probation. And if you do that 2 times in a row, you will lose compliance. You cannot be on probation 2 years in a row. No vendor can do that. It doesn't happen that often. Usually if you see a vendor in red, please feel free to reach out. We will let you know why they're on probation. Usually it has something to do with missing their recertification date by a day or 2, or we had one at one point that went on for missing the annual meeting. They were unable to attend at the last minute, and they were unable to get anyone to take the place, so they went on probation that year. So please always feel free to reach out if you have any questions about probation. And then there's also the monthly activity report that Monet sends out, and it has all of the information about the vendors, which vendors need to come up for compliance quickly, which ones have just finished compliance, and which ones are actively testing. And then quarterly, we send out a note to the vendors and let them know the next 6-month picture, right? So we do our best to keep vendors up to date, aware of what's going on, and that their dates are coming up. But ultimately, we do hold the vendor responsible to keep their compliance and to do it by the dates that they are given. Testing for the NEMSIS standard. These are the things that we do. Can the vendor software send and receive SOAP messages? So you'll hear SOAP a lot. Basically, that is the software that structure that can be utilized to send and receive the ePCR or demographic data. It will have its own credentials. It'll have possibly additional security measures, things like that. So can they send the file, and then can they receive the message that goes with that? Successful, warnings, failures, all of that will come over in SOAP messages. Can the vendor software collect, send, receive all of the NEMSIS elements, not just the national ones? We look at the optional, the recommended, the required, and the mandatory. Can they create and collect custom elements? I will say we do our best to use existing custom elements rather than come up with something new that we're asking the vendors to do. And that's because it does take time and effort to develop those custom elements. You see in our best practices guide for custom elements that we recommend the 90-day window to allow for vendors to create custom elements. So we do our best to try and alleviate that part of the burden during compliance process. So we'll use an existing national custom element during testing. Can a receive and process vendor software receive all of the elements from a state or an EPCR system and then send the national data repository national only elements? So that means all of the patient identifying information is going to be stripped out, right? So that is basically, can I get more information and send out less? Can a receive and process vendor software detect an XSD or fatal error that would prevent the submission of an EPCR? So we're going to talk a little bit more about XSD later, but that's basically the structure of the XML file. And what we're testing there is, do they recognize when a file is not formatted correctly? So it's important that the receive and process vendors send those messages back to the provider agencies or the local EMS agencies, whoever has received that data. It's important to send that message back so it can be fixed, so they can look at it, because that's a structure error right there. And then we also do look at XML errors as well, and that would be more along the lines of your schematron validation errors. And so we're looking for those messages. Can they be received? Can they be sent? Can they be accepted? So here's some more specifics about the receive and process software. Recognizing the failed records that we just touched on, right? So 2 things that are important to know. You'll hear XML a lot in the NEMSIS standard, right? That is extensible markup language. And this is the format of the EMS files, the demographic files, and the state data sets. When you are sending files back and forth, it's in an XML format. XSD is the XML schema definition, and that's the structure of the XML format. I like to kind of use the analogy that XSD is like the bones, right? You got to have all those bones in place to be able to work properly. And then the XML, that's going to be everything that's inside the body that makes everything work. That's kind of the analogy that I use for that. So if there is a error along those lines for the structure itself, you will get a SOAP message status code of -12, and it will tell you that you have an error, and whatever error that is, it will give you information. That's when sometimes you see things that say child element or parent element or something along those lines. If you get a confusing message, reach out to the NEMSIS help desk. We are more than happy to help explain those, or talk to your vendor, because your vendor should be able to help you with that as well. And then there's the -14, which is the validation schematron errors, right? That means you broke a rule that the state or local EMS agency has put into their system for creating that EPCR. And that should happen, that should be able to be seen when you're creating a PCR and you go to transmit, or before that you send it, to the state. You should know when you've broken a rule. So no demographic file submitted and processed before EMS file submission, -2005. If you are a state data manager, you're probably pretty familiar with this one. This means that at the national level, you have have not sent a demographic file that goes with that agency you're trying to submit data for. So it's important to know that at the national level, we must have a demographic file in the system, on the list, as an agency you submit data for before you start to send EMS files. We recommend anywhere from 48 to 96 hours before you start to send EMS PCRs after you've sent the demographic file. And that's so that you can check to make sure once it's processed that it passed, because it could take 48 hours to process that demographic. And if it fails, you need to be able to have time to receive that information back from your receive and process vendor so that you can get that corrected and resubmit the demographic file. Do you have a process with your vendor to work on? These are important things for your state data managers or your local EMS agencies that have their own receive and process systems in place, have a process with your vendor. Know when those failures are occurring, when you are sending data outside. You should also know when those failures are occurring when data is coming to you. And there should be some sort of process that gives that information back to your agencies through SOAP messages, and then their EPCR collect and send systems should work with them. Do you know when state records that are submitted to NEMSIS fail and how to resolve them? That's an important question to ask yourself. If you don't, let's talk about it, right? Talk with your vendor. You can call us and say, hey, Jen talked about that on the training. Didn't quite get it. What do you guys want us to do? What is it that we should be doing? And we can have that conversation. And it's also important to involve your vendors in that, right? Because your vendors will be able to help you and to resolve those failures. We're really focusing on missingness and making sure that we are getting all the records, and at the state level, you are too. So we want to make sure all that information is getting here. Retrieve status message, that's those SOAP messages that we talked about, right? So those are from failed records, and those are responses from the receive and process software regarding the file submission. It is important to note, you can also have a successful submission. So never forget those successful submissions do happen. And then we have a little bit more to talk. The ability to create a state data set. Receive and process softwares are tested on this. They must create a state data set for a fictitious state that we're using for testing. Now, sometimes we'll use Delaware, right? Or we'll use New Hampshire, or we'll use California. We'll use an existing state, but we're going to adjust that existing state data set. And the vendor must create that state data set and submit it to us. They also need to show us that they have the ability to update a state data set. That's the user interface that they use for that, with a change log. And that change log is what appears on the website when you go and you look at the state data sets for each individual state. So that's something else that they're tested on. They're tested on the ability to receive, process, transmit the XML files with various NEMSIS elements. So there are a DEM file and 5 different EMS files, right? And they contain almost all of the NEMSIS standard elements within one of those files, right? We do ask that they use optional and recommended as well, and they have no changes to a designated endpoint, right? So what that means is that when you submit a file from your collect and send software to the receive and process vendor, that they are able to transmit that record without any change whatsoever. That's the first thing they're tested on. And then they're tested on the ability to send that same file with national elements only. And it's important to do that because that makes sure that they can send data both to your national data repository and to your registries. Getting them out there to CARES, to ODMAP, to any, registry that you're working with, any vendor that you're working with, a QA process, anything you have going on is not going to want national elements only. It's probably going to want more than that. So that's why we test on both. And then we have a web conference, and that's basically just gives us a chance to view their user interface. For the receive and process software, that's usually where they're developing the state data set. How are you entering the medications that are allowed? How are you entering what levels can do which procedures? How are you entering the facilities, the units, that kind of information that you include in your state data set? So we're looking at all that information. Can they put it together, and can they send it to the National Data Repository, and can they send it on to other registries and QA, QI, billing, all those kinds of things. Now let's talk about collect and send software, unless we have any specific questions regarding the receive and process software. All right. So collect and send software. First thing that we test for is the demographic files, right? The ability to create an EMS provider agency's demographic file from a test example. So we provide HTML documents that have various information, units, facilities, personnel. And we utilize a lot of the optional recommended in our demographic file to make sure that they can collect anything a state or an agency may be interested in collecting that's beyond the national elements. And then they're tested on the ability to transmit the demographic file to a designated endpoint. So that is our testing environment. And we send and receive those SOAP messages we talked about earlier within that testing environment. So when they make their submission, they get a response of whether it was successful, whether it had a warning, or whether it had an error. They get all of that information back and forth. The ability to update and transmit a demographic XML file is tested during the web conference. So we ask them to make changes to those demographic XMLs, and then we're checking those UUIDs for consistency, right? So if we have them change a name of one of the personnel, that UUID for that person should remain the same, even though their name changes, because that UUID within the demographic file is identifying that person. So we test on the UUID consistency for the demographics. We have a custom element in every demographic file for the collect and send, right? So sometimes it extends an existing element. Sometimes it's creating a new element. We look for the proper placement of correlation IDs. When no correlation ID is needed, we look for the proper e-custom results section, and we're testing them on all of that in the collect and send software. And again, we try to use existing custom elements from the National Custom Library. During the web conference for the demographics, we make a lot of changes and we review their user interface that they've created for the EMS provider agencies to enter their data, right? We're also testing on error and warning messages that are created just for testing. So we have specific schematron validation rules that are written up every year that send back a specific test message so that, and they're only given those schematrons 15 minutes prior to the web conference. So they have to load that schematron and change the data and submit that during the web conference. So they're tested on that ability as well. And then we've got the EMS file for collect and send. Right, so the ability to create EMS XML file, and again, they have 5 test files that they're creating, and they're doing all of the data entry from HTML documents. The ability to transmit those to our testing environment, and the ability to update and transmit corrected information during the web conference. Again, we're checking for the UUID consistency that identifies that ePCR, so we want to make sure that that UUID is the same. When they send in corrected information. We're also making sure that they can resend data with corrections, right? Because that's a big part of the process. Once you transmit the original EMS file, there could be updates that happen later. There could be changes that are made that need to be resubmitted to the state or to the local EMS agency, the receive and process software, whoever that is. And it's important that they can do that and that the changes can be recognized. During the web conference, we make a lot of changes. We have them resubmit, and we review their user interface for the ability to enter the data. So we go through every screen during the web conference, and we're looking to make sure that they have an element or field available for everything in NEMSIS. So we know that you do not collect every single element in NEMSIS, but you have the ability to want something. And so as part of the NEMSIS standard, we make sure they have that in their software. We also look at their custom element data entry. How is that entered? Is it, does it make sense? Are they, putting in their own correlation IDs, or is it all done for them? How is it generating that custom element? And then again, we look for error and warning messages. They are sent the schematrons again 15 minutes prior to the web conference. They load them in their software, and then we make a change that's going to trigger those rules, and we look for the verbiage that we have in the schematron. And that is how the web conference, that's how it kind of all ties back together, right? So we're looking at how the ePCR collect and send is created, that they have the ability to collect the information, that they have the ability to update the information, send the information, and receive those SOAP messages back and forth from the receive and process vendor. And then the receive and process vendor, we are testing them on the ability to ingest from the collect and send softwares and the ability to send that information to registries, to the National Data Repository, to basically anywhere that the state is sharing their information. Test file information, just a few specifics. The files change every year. And if someone applies in November or December, they will be working with the previous year. If they happen to go over January, we don't ask them, oh, sorry for all the data entry you've done so far. You have to start with new ones. There's a grace period for that. Previous year becomes pre-testing records. So there are pre-testing records available for all vendors to pre-test their systems to make sure that they're ready for the compliance process. And we just use the old test files from the compliance process for those. Event types vary, right? So we'll have cardiac arrest calls, motor vehicle crashes, suicides, overdoses, transfers. We even have cancels in there because we want to make sure if the only thing we want to see is the canceled information, the bare minimum of information that goes with that, we want to test that that's all that they're going to be sending, and that they have the correct not applicables versus not recorded in their system. So there could be any type of call type that comes in for that. I said earlier, there's 5 EMS and 1 DEM file that are successfully transmitted. We also have some failures that we purposely send to the receive and process vendors that need to fail, right? If they don't fail, that sends up a flag that it's not recognizing something that it should be recognizing. So there are some failures that we send for receive and process. We do not set up our collect and send folks that way. And then what can't we test for? So this is a big question. And when we get asked a lot, right? Like, well, why can't you test for this? We can only test for the NEMSIS standard. We can't require them to have every custom element within the custom element library. Those are not part of the NEMSIS standard. So we can't test that the software has absolutely everything possible, right? We also cannot verify that the software we've tested is exactly what's provided to that EMS provider agency. That's the honor system right there, that what you've tested with is what you're providing to your customers. And there's no way for us to check that kind of thing. Customers are allowed to make changes to their software, right? If you're EMS provider agency and you are not a billing agency, you don't bill, you may not want to answer a question about billing, right? So that kind of customization is not something that we test for during the compliance system. That is strictly between the customer and the vendor themselves. We can't test for absolutely every combination of NEMSIS elements. We try. I will say Josh Legler creates our testing records now, and he does a great job of trying to get everything into those test files, but there's no way for us to test for every possible combination. And that's where you come in. So if you find something that's not working, let us know. That way, when you let us know, we can look at it from the national perspective. If it's something that is in the standard, or if it's something that's in the national schematron that's causing a warning, we can take a look at it and see if that's something that can be improved, right? So we hope that you will be our partners in that as well. We cannot test for state-created custom elements. They are tested on custom elements, but not every single state-created custom element. If we use Nebraska as our testing state, we're not going to include every custom element from Nebraska for them to test. We're still only going to pull a few of the national custom elements for the testing. We also cannot test on state-created validation rules. So as everybody knows, the states are allowed to tighten up on national rules and make some of our warnings errors. You're allowed to create wholly new rules for your validation purposes to help guide documentation processes within your state. We cannot test for every state created validation rule. What we do is that process during the web conference where we supply them with a schematron with a couple of specific rules, looking for warning and error messages. And that's what we can test for, but not every variation of validation rules that are out there. And then we also can't test for what the EMS provider agencies change outside of the NEMSIS standard, right? So hopefully if they do something that violates the NEMSIS standard, that those files will fail upon submission to the state, and you'll be aware and you'll be able to notify your EMS provider agency that a change that was made actually violates the standard. And there's many different things that the customer could ask the vendor to do, right? And you hope the vendor will be able to help them and guide them and let them know if something goes outside of the NEMSIS standard or goes outside of your state rules and validation system. That's not always the case. So that leaves room for the EMS provider agencies and the states to talk as well as the vendors. There's many changes that could be included. They could remove descriptions from the lists, right? They could say, oh, we're not going to allow the, crews to say, no, there was no cardiac arrest. I know no one's going to do that. That's why I use that as an example. They could add descriptions to the list, right? That's customization. They could create a custom element within their EMS provider agency. The good news about that is if they do that, they should be tying it back to an existing NEMSIS element. So if the state doesn't have that custom element, you would get the original NEMSIS value. Or they could change the rules within their collection system, within their EPCR data collection system. They could change the rules from the state schematron. They can make them stricter, which I have seen, believe it or not. Or they could try and remove them, right? So that's where when they get submitted to the state, you've got to look at those warnings, you've got to look at those errors, because that's how you're going to be able to work with your EMS provider agency and find out if they've done anything that's outside of not just the NEMSIS standard, but your state standard. So those are the types of things we can't test for. We get asked that question on a regular basis, especially the combination of NEMSIS elements, right? When you use this, and this, something broke, right? So just let us know if that happens. That way we can review, fix, change, especially as folks are starting to get transitioned over to version 3.50. There may be something that's missed because it's a real outlier type of call that happens once every, 25 million calls, those kinds of things. And so here's some contact information. Again, there's a QR code. This is the help desk website, as well as a QR code to get to the help desk. If you have any questions, whether it's about compliance, whether it's about a NEMSIS element, anything that we can help with, please don't hesitate to open up a help desk ticket. And the help desk tickets really are the best way to go. That way the questions can get submitted directly to the best person to answer them for you. Or if someone goes on vacation, someone can step in and ask, and you're not waiting for a response to an email or a phone call. We also have another more in-depth compliance training overview and Q&A that was done by Laurel a couple years ago that's available. There's a QR code to that. It's also on our calls and trainings page on the NEMSIS website as well. I haven't been watching the chat, so
You have a question, Jen, from Rich Cooper.
Okay, let me go ahead and pull that up. Chip says, so the challenge seems to be that I have run into a couple of vendors who have passed NEMSIS compliance, but basically didn't have a functional UI for their customers that would properly collect NEMSIS elements, even national required fields. Is there a means to close the loop when we run into this? Absolutely. Let us know if you run into a vendor, especially a vendor that's listed on our NEMSIS compliance page, that does not have a functional UI, because that is part of the web conference for the collect and send vendors, that we look at their UI. And again, it's on the honor system that what we test them on, what they show us is what they put out to their customers and the EMS provider agencies. So please let us know. And then I can send that on to our leadership here to have conversations and handle those kinds of things. That's a great question, Chip. I am not seeing any other questions. So everybody has our contact information. If there are no other questions, we'll all get a few minutes back in our day. Thank you very, very much for attending. We all know here at the NEMSIS TAC how busy everyone is. And I know you hear us say this and you probably think that it's, you know, written on all of our walls somewhere, but it really isn't. We really mean it. Thank you for taking the time that you spend with us to improve the NEMSIS standard, to learn about the NEMSIS standard, and to make this process better. Without you, without our partners, this just doesn't work. And you guys are great. So thank you very, very much. And I will go ahead and send it back to you, Chris.
Perfect. Thank you, Jen. And Lori has placed a whole bunch of handy dandy links into the chat here. So some of the resources that Jen was talking about are available on those links. If you do have a question, if this meeting has been recorded, it will be on our YouTube channel shortly, so that if you want to refer back to this or share with a colleague, please feel free to do that. If you get a chance, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and you can be updated and notified when we are having events such as today. Other than that, thank you, Jen, and thanks everybody for attending, and have a great rest of your day.